He wasn't supposed to find them there. When the officer stepped onto the rooftop, he expected silence. Maybe an empty ledge, maybe nothing at all. Instead, he saw two small figures standing where no one should ever stand. The younger one was crying. The older girl held her tightly, staring out at the city below as if she had already made up her mind. That's when he realized something, and in that exact moment, he understood why they were standing there. But by then, it might have already been too late. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's begin. The radio crackled at 11:47 p.m. Daniel Harper had been sitting in his patrol car for the past hour, parked outside a gas station on the edge of downtown, drinking cold coffee and staring at nothing in particular. It had been one of those nights, quiet on the outside, loud on the inside. The kind of night where the silence gives your thoughts too much room to move around. He was 42 years old, 17 years on the force, and lately, he had started to feel like he was disappearing inside his own life. Showing up to work, going home, waking up, doing it all again. Like a clock that kept ticking but had forgotten what time it was keeping. Then the call came. Unit 7, we have an anonymous report. 2 children spotted on the roof of the Callaway building on 5th and Meridian. Caller said they've been up there for at least 20 minutes. No adult present. Daniel sat up straight. The Callaway building. He knew it. Everyone in the department did. It used to be a residential complex. Affordable housing for working families. Closed down 3 years ago after funding cuts. Now it just stood there, hollow and forgotten. Like a lot of things in this city that people stopped paying attention to. He pulled out of the parking lot without a word and drove. The building came into view 2 minutes later. 6 stories. Broken windows on the lower floors. A chain-link fence around the entrance that someone had clearly pushed open more than once. Daniel radioed his position, grabbed his flashlight, and went inside. The elevator hadn't worked in years. He took the stairs. Each floor he passed was empty. Dusty hallways, peeling wallpaper, doors that hung halfway open like mouths frozen mid-sentence. His footsteps echoed. His flashlight cut through the dark in long, steady sweeps. By the 5th floor, he heard something. Wind. And underneath it, the faint sound of a child crying. He moved faster. The rooftop door was already open. A cold breeze pushed against him as he stepped outside. The city spread out in every direction. 1,000 lights blinking in the dark, indifferent and beautiful all at once. And there, near the far edge of the rooftop, stood 2 small figures. Daniel stopped breathing for a second. The younger one, she couldn't have been more than 5, had her face buried against the older girl's shoulder. Her small body shook with quiet sobs. The older girl, maybe 11 or 12, stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped around her little sister. Her eyes were fixed on something far away, somewhere across the city, past the rooftops and the lights, focused on something only she could see. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look lost. She looked like someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. Daniel's training told him to call for backup, to follow protocol, to announce himself loudly and clearly. But something deeper, something that had nothing to do with his badge, made him go still. He watched the older girl tighten her arms around her sister. He watched the little one reach up and grip the back of her sister's jacket with both fists, holding on the way children hold on when they're afraid the person they love most might disappear. And then the older girl turned. She looked directly at Daniel. Her eyes were steady, dark, older than they had any right to be. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at him the way someone looks at a person they've been expecting. Not with hope exactly, but with something close to it. Daniel took one slow step forward, and in that moment, standing on a rooftop in the middle of the night with the wind pulling at his jacket and the city glowing beneath them, he realized something had shifted. Not just in the scene in front of him, inside him. He just didn't know yet what it meant, but he was about to find out. Daniel didn't move fast. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for his radio. He just stood there a few feet from the rooftop door and let the girl look at him. The wind moved between them like a third presence, quiet, invisible, carrying the sounds of the city up from the streets below. Somewhere far away, a siren faded into nothing. Up here it felt like the rest of the world had simply stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you," Daniel said. His voice came out lower than he expected. Softer. The older girl didn't flinch. She kept her arms around her little sister and tilted her chin up slightly, not in defiance, but in the way someone does when they've already decided they won't be afraid. "I know," she said. 2 words. Calm and certain. And somehow, those 2 words hit Daniel harder than anything else could have. He took another slow step forward and lowered himself onto one knee so he wasn't towering over them. The rooftop gravel pressed through his uniform pants. He didn't care. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause, then, "Emily. And your sister?" The little girl peeked out from behind Emily's shoulder. 1 eye, then 2. She had tears drying on her cheeks and a smear of something, maybe peanut butter, near the corner of her mouth. She looked at Daniel the way small children look at strangers, sizing him up with an honesty that adults forget how to use. "Sophie," Emily answered for her. Daniel nodded slowly. "Those are beautiful names." Sophie studied him for another second. Then, with the kind of unpredictable logic that only belongs to 5-year-olds, she held out her hand, small fingers spread wide, and showed him something she'd been clutching the whole time. A folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, held together by care. Emily immediately closed Sophie's fingers back around it. "Not yet," she whispered to her sister. Daniel pretended not to notice. He kept his eyes on Emily. "Are you cold?" he asked. She shook her head, but her shoulders said otherwise. He reached into his jacket slowly, making sure she could see every movement, and pulled out the spare thermal he kept folded in his inner pocket. He held it out toward her without stepping closer, an offering, not a demand. Emily looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it. She wrapped it around Sophie without putting it on herself. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He sat down fully on the gravel then, cross-legged, unhurried, like a man with nowhere else to be. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the city the same direction Emily had been looking. "You can see a lot from up here," he said quietly. "That's why we came," Emily said. It wasn't what he expected. He turned to look at her. "What are you trying to see?" Emily didn't answer right away. She looked out across the rooftops, past the office buildings and the glowing signs, toward the far edge of the city where the lights clustered together in one bright patch. Then she said, "The hospital." 1 word. And in that 1 word, Daniel heard an entire world. He followed her gaze. Across the distance, he could make out the pale glow of Mercy General, its windows lit against the dark sky, steady and constant. His throat tightened. "Someone you love is there?" he asked. Emily nodded once. Small, controlled. Sophie tugged at her sister's sleeve and said something too quiet to hear. Emily leaned down, listened, then looked back at Daniel. "She wants to know if you have kids," Emily said. The question landed somewhere Daniel wasn't prepared for. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Yeah," he said finally. "I do." Emily studied him. "Do you see her a lot?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Not enough," he said. The honesty surprised even him. He hadn't planned on saying it. It came out the way true things do, without permission. Emily was quiet after that, but something in her expression shifted. Just barely, like a door that hadn't opened, but had, for the first time, unlocked. Then she said something that stopped everything. "You're going to separate us, aren't you?" Daniel opened his mouth and found nothing there, because the answer, the honest, devastating answer, was that he didn't know, and she could see it on his face before he said a single word. The silence that followed Emily's question didn't last long, but it lasted long enough. Daniel saw it happen in real time. The way her expression shifted when he didn't answer immediately. Not anger, not tears. Something quieter and more painful than both. The look of a child who had already learned that hesitation from an adult usually meant the answer was no. He hated that she knew that. "Emily." He said her name carefully, the way you'd set something fragile down on a table. "I'm not here to make any decisions tonight. I'm just here because someone called and said 2 kids were on this rooftop, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring. "We are okay," she said. "We just needed to see." "See what?" She glanced toward the hospital lights again. "That she's still there." Sophie, who had been sitting quietly wrapped in Daniel's thermal, looked up at her sister's face and then back at the distant glow of Mercy General. As if she understood completely, as if this was something they had talked about before. a ritual between them, private and important. Daniel watched them both. Something about the way they moved together, the quiet coordination, the unspoken language between them, made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. "Your grandma?" he asked gently. Emily nodded. "Her name is Linda. She went to the hospital 4 days ago." She paused. "Nobody tells us anything. The lady from the state just said we had to wait." "What lady?" "The one who came to the apartment." Emily's voice stayed flat, controlled. "She said if Grandma Linda couldn't take care of us, they'd have to find another arrangement." She said the last 2 words the way a 12-year-old says something she heard adults say, carefully, like she wasn't quite sure what they weighed, but could feel that they were heavy. Daniel exhaled slowly. "And that scared you?" "It didn't scare me," Emily said. Then after a pause, "It scared Sophie." Sophie, hearing her name, reached over and slipped her small hand into Emily's. Emily squeezed it without looking down, automatic, like breathing. That was when Sophie looked at Daniel with those wide, serious eyes and held out the folded piece of paper again. This time, Emily didn't stop her. Daniel reached over slowly and took it. He unfolded it with care. The paper was soft from being handled so many times, the creases deep and permanent. The handwriting inside was shaky, but deliberate. Large letters, the kind someone writes when their hands aren't entirely steady but their intention is completely clear. "My girls, you are never lost as long as you have each other. When you feel alone, go somewhere high and look out. The world is bigger than your worry. I'll find my way back to you. I always do." Grandma Linda. Daniel read it twice. He folded it back exactly the way it had been and held it out to Sophie. She took it with both hands and pressed it against her chest. "She gave you this before she went to the hospital?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "She gave it to us a long time ago. We just bring it everywhere now." Daniel nodded slowly. He looked out at the city, at the hospital lights, at the 1,000 small lives flickering below them, none of them knowing that 3 people were sitting on a rooftop right now, holding something together that the world kept trying to pull apart. "Your grandma sounds like someone pretty remarkable," he said. Emily's jaw tightened slightly, not with sadness, with pride. "She is." They sat in silence for a moment, comfortable somehow. The wind had softened. Sophie had leaned her head against Emily's arm and was fighting sleep with everything she had, eyes drooping, then snapping back open, determined not to miss anything. Daniel smiled a little, despite everything. Then his radio crackled. A voice on the other end, his sergeant checking in, asking for a status update. Daniel looked at Emily. She looked back at him, and in her eyes he saw it clearly. The question she wasn't asking out loud. "Are you going to make this worse now?" He pressed the radio button. "Everything's under control," he said. "Give me a few more minutes." Emily blinked. Something moved across her face, fast, almost hidden, but Daniel saw it. It was the very first trace of trust. Linda May Calloway had never once asked the world for more than she needed. That was the thing people didn't understand about women like her. They looked at her small apartment, the worn couch, the second-hand curtains, the kitchen table with the uneven leg propped up by a folded envelope, and they assumed she had simply ended up there. That life had happened to her. They didn't see the choice in it. Linda had worked for 31 years, cleaning offices, mopping hospital floors, pressing other people's clothes. She had done it without complaint and without apology, because that was how her own mother had raised her. You carry what you're given, and you carry it with your chin up. She had raised her daughter, Renee, the same way. But Renee had married young, and Renee's husband, Carl, had taken a job at a warehouse outside the city, the kind of job that paid just enough to feel stable, until the day he hurt his backlifting equipment and the doctor handed him a prescription that changed everything. Linda never blamed Carl. She had seen too much of life to believe that good people couldn't get lost. The pills came first as relief, then as routine, then as something neither Carl nor Renee could name out loud. By the time anyone understood what was happening, Carl was gone. And Renee, her daughter, her girl, had disappeared into a grief so deep that it swallowed her whole. She left one morning and didn't come back. Emily was 4 years old. Sophie hadn't been born yet. Linda never talked about that morning. Not to the social workers, not to the neighbors, not to the girls. Some stories, she believed, didn't need to be told out loud to be carried. She simply became their mother. Quietly, completely. She stretched every dollar until it apologized. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread on Tuesday evenings. She kept the heat low and added an extra blanket instead. She cut her blood pressure pills in half when the prescription ran out and the refill cost more than she had, telling herself it would be fine, just for a few days, just until the check came. She never told the girls. She had tried once to ask for help. 3 weeks before the hospital, she had called the social services number she found in a pamphlet at the pharmacy. She waited on hold for 40 minutes, explained her situation carefully to a tired voice on the other end, was told someone would follow up within 5 to 7 business days. Nobody called back. She didn't try again, not because she had given up, but because every hour she spent on the phone was an hour she wasn't home with the girls. And the girls in her mind always came first. What Linda didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the morning she collapsed in the kitchen, Sophie had been the one to find her. The little girl had stood in the doorway for a moment, not fully understanding. Then she had gone to get Emily. Emily had called 911. She had stayed on the phone the entire time, answering every question, her voice steady in the way that children's voices become steady when they have no other choice. She had held Sophie's hand while the paramedics worked. She had watched the ambulance leave without them, and then she had sat down on the kitchen floor with her sister, in the quiet that followed, and made a promise she hadn't said out loud, only felt. That she would figure it out, that she would not let Sophie be afraid, that whatever happened next, they would face it together. That was the promise Emily had been keeping every hour since. Daniel didn't know any of this yet, but Linda's neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Tran who slid food under the door when she knew things were hard, had watched all of it happen. She had been the one to make the anonymous call the night the girls went to the rooftop. She had done it out of love. And somewhere in a hospital bed across the city, Linda May Calloway lay with a monitor beeping beside her, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, thinking only one thing: please, not yet. I'm not finished yet. Daniel didn't sleep that night. After he brought Emily and Sophie safely down from the rooftop, after the paperwork, after the handoff to the temporary shelter, after the long drive home through empty streets, he sat at his kitchen table and stared at the wall. His apartment was quiet in the way that apartments get quiet when only one person lives in them for too long. The refrigerator hummed. A faucet dripped somewhere down the hall, the kind of sounds you stop hearing after a while, until a night like this, when everything suddenly becomes too loud. He thought about Emily's eyes, the way she had looked at him when he hesitated to answer her question, the way she already knew, at 12 years old, that hesitation meant something. He thought about Sophie pressing that folded note against her chest, and then, without fully meaning to, he thought about Grace, his daughter. She was 16 now. She lived with her mother, Karen, in a house 40 minutes away that Daniel had driven past exactly twice in the last year, both times without stopping. Not because he didn't want to, because he had convinced himself that wanting wasn't enough, that showing up broken was worse than not showing up at all. He had been wrong about that. He knew it the way you know things you're not ready to fix yet. Grace had been 11 when Karen finally said the words that ended their marriage. Not with cruelty. Karen had never been cruel. She had simply been honest. You are here, Daniel, but you are never present. And I can't keep explaining that difference to our daughter. He had thrown himself into work after that. More shifts, more cases, more reasons to be somewhere other than an empty apartment with his own thoughts. He told himself he was providing. He told himself Grace understood. She didn't. He found out, not from Grace, not from Karen, but from a school counselor who called him 14 months ago, that Grace had been going through a difficult period, withdrawing from friends, missing school. There had been a few weeks where she had dealt with her pain in ways that had frightened the people around her. Nothing that required hospitalization, but enough. Enough for the counselor to call. Enough for Daniel to sit in his car outside the school for 20 minutes before driving away without going in. He had told himself he needed time to figure out what to say. That was 14 months ago. He still hadn't figured it out. Now he sat at his kitchen table and thought about a 12-year-old girl on a rooftop who had wrapped a thermal blanket around her little sister before herself, who had squeezed Sophie's hand without looking down, who had kept a folded note safe through days of uncertainty, because it was the closest thing she had to the person she loved most. Emily had never stopped showing up. and Daniel had made a career out of almost doing it. He reached for his phone, scrolled to Grace's name, stared at it for a long time. He didn't call, but he didn't put the phone down either. He just held it, the way Sophie had held that note. Like letting go wasn't something he was ready for yet. The next morning, he went back to the station and pulled the file on Emily and Sophie's case. He told himself it was professional curiosity. Standard follow-up. He knew that wasn't true. The assigned caseworker was listed at the bottom of the intake form, a name he recognized immediately. Ms. A. Caldwell, Family Services District 4. Daniel set the paper down slowly. Angela Caldwell. He knew that name. He hadn't heard it in years, but he knew it. She had been the caseworker assigned to his family during the divorce proceedings, back when Karen had briefly requested a custody evaluation. Angela Caldwell had sat across from him in a gray office and asked him questions he hadn't answered honestly. He wondered if she remembered. He wondered, more quietly, if she had seen in him then what he was only beginning to see in himself now. He picked up the phone, not to call Grace. Not yet. He called Ms. Caldwell. Ms. Angela Caldwell did not sound surprised to hear from him. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. He had expected hesitation, maybe a pause while she searched her memory for his name. Instead, she simply said, "Officer Harper, I was wondering when you'd call." He didn't know what to do with that, so he moved forward. "I'm calling about the Morrison girls," he said. "Emily and Sophie. I was the responding officer on the rooftop call 2 nights ago." "I know," she said. "I read your report." A pause, then. "You stayed up there with them for 40 minutes before calling it in." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't nothing either. "I needed them to trust me first," he said. Angela was quiet for a moment. "That's not standard protocol, Officer Harper." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Another pause, longer this time. He heard papers shifting on her end. The background sound of a busy office. Phones ringing. Someone speaking quickly in another room. "The girls are currently in temporary placement at Hillside," she said finally. "Together for now. But I have to be honest with you. The situation is complicated. Mrs. Calloway's medical condition is serious. Until we have a clearer picture of her prognosis, the girls remain under state supervision. And if Linda can't return to full care?" Angela exhaled. Not dramatically. The exhale of someone who has had this conversation too many times. "Then we look at available options. Extended family first. If none are viable, we move to licensed foster placement." "Together?" Daniel asked. The pause that followed was its own answer. "We make every effort," Angela said carefully. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. "We make every effort." He had heard phrases like that his entire career, phrases that meant, "We try," but the system has rules, and the rules don't always bend for feelings. "I want to visit them," he said. "The girls." "You're not a family member, Officer Harper." "I know that. And you're not a licensed foster carer." "I know that too." Silence. "I just want to make sure they're okay," he said. And then, because it was true, and he was tired of not saying true things, "I promised them I wouldn't disappear." Angela didn't respond immediately. He heard her chair shift, a drawer opening and closing. "I can authorize a follow-up welfare visit," she said finally. "As the responding officer, 30 minutes. Tomorrow at 10. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. "Bring something for Sophie. She hasn't let go of a paper she's been carrying since she arrived. The staff tried to take it for safekeeping and she cried for an hour." Daniel almost smiled. "I know what paper that is." He arrived at Hillside Family Shelter the next morning with a small brown bag, 2 apples, a box of crackers, and a children's book he had found at the gas station near his apartment. It wasn't much. It was what he had. The building was clean but institutional. Long hallways, fluorescent lights, the kind of place that tried its best and still felt like trying. A staff member led him to a common room where Emily and Sophie were sitting at a table. Sophie was drawing. Emily was watching the door. When she saw Daniel, something in her shoulders released, just slightly, like a breath she had been holding. Sophie looked up, saw him, and immediately held up her drawing for him to see. Stick figures. Crayon. 2 small ones and 1 tall one standing in front of a yellow square. He sat down across from them. "That's a great house," he said to Sophie. She nodded seriously. "It has 2 windows." He looked at Emily. She was watching him with that steady, measuring gaze. They said we might not stay together, she said. No preamble, no softening. Daniel looked at her directly. I know. I'm working on it. You can't promise that, she said. No, he admitted. I can't promise it. But I can promise I'm not going to stop trying. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. There's a couple, she said quietly. The staff mentioned them. The Whitmore family. They said they're interested in taking us. Daniel kept his expression steady. I heard. Are they nice? He paused. I don't know them. Emily nodded slowly. Then she said something that stayed with Daniel for the rest of the day. Nice doesn't always mean safe, she said. And she went back to watching the door, like someone who had learned, early and well, that the most important things in life tend to walk in and out of rooms without warning. The letter arrived on Angela Caldwell's desk on a Thursday morning. It had been written on notebook paper, the kind with the thin blue lines and the red margin running down the left side. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The letters slightly uneven in the way that happens when someone is writing something important and their hand knows it. It was from Emily. Angela read it once. Then she set it down, took off her glasses, and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it again. Dear Grandma Linda, I don't know if anyone is going to give you this. I'm giving it to the lady at the desk and asking her to try. Sophie is okay. She's been drawing a lot. She drew a house today with 2 windows. I didn't tell her I was writing this. I want to explain something in case nobody else does. The night we went to the rooftop, I know it probably looked bad. I know the policeman was scared. I could tell. But I need you to know that I wasn't scared. I wasn't trying to do anything dangerous. I would never do that. I promised you I would always take care of Sophie, and I meant it. I just needed to see the hospital. You always told us that when everything feels too big, we should go somewhere high and look out. You said the world looks different from up there. You said it looks like it's still working. So that's what I did. I stood up there, and I looked at the lights across the city, and I found the hospital, and I watched it for a while, and it helped, because the lights were on, and that meant people were there, and that meant someone was taking care of you. I know you always say you don't need taking care of, but Grandma, you do, and that's okay. You took care of us for so long. It's allowed to be someone else's turn. I'm not angry at the system or the lady from the state or anyone. I'm just asking, please don't let them separate us. Sophie needs me and I need her. We're not easier apart. We're just lonelier. I love you more than the city lights. Angela folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. I need you to come in, she said. There's something you should read. He was there within the hour. She watched his face as he read, watched the moment his jaw tightened, watched him reach the part about the hospital lights and go very still. He read the whole thing without speaking. When he finished, he set it down on her desk and looked at the window for a moment, at the gray sky outside, at the parking lot below, at nothing in particular. She went up there to feel close to her grandmother. He said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes, Angela said. She wasn't. He stopped, started again. She was protecting Sophie. The whole time, even up there, she was protecting her. Yes. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, what happens now? Angela leaned back in her chair. The Whitmore family has submitted a formal application for placement. They're qualified. They have space. On paper, they're a strong option. And off paper? She looked at him carefully. Off paper? I have a letter from a 12-year-old girl that I can't stop thinking about. Daniel nodded slowly. He looked down at the letter again, at Emily's careful handwriting, at the words we're not easier apart, we're just lonelier, and something settled in him. Not a decision exactly, more like the moment just before a decision, when everything gets quiet and clear. I want to apply, he said. Angela looked at him. Apply for what, Officer Harper? He met her eyes. Temporary guardianship, he said. For both of them. The room was quiet for a moment. Angela studied him, the way she had studied him years ago across a different desk in a different context, looking for the same thing she always looked for. Not perfection, not credentials. Sincerity. That's a long road, she said. You understand that. I know. Inspections, evaluations, background checks, financial review. I know. And you're aware that the Whitmore family is also in consideration. I know that too. She was quiet for another moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a single form. She slid it across the desk toward him. "Then you'd better start here," she said. Daniel picked up the form. He looked at it for a moment. The boxes, the lines, the official weight of it. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. Mercy General Hospital smelled the way all hospitals smell, like clean floors and careful air, like a place that was trying very hard to hold difficult things together. Daniel stood at the front desk on a Tuesday afternoon with his badge in his hand, feeling less like a police officer and more like a man who wasn't entirely sure he belonged there. He had called ahead. Angela had made a call of her own. Linda had been told someone was coming. Whether she wanted to see him, that was a different question. The nurse at the desk was kind and efficient. She gave him a visitor pass and pointed down a long corridor to room 114. He thanked her and walked slowly, reading the room numbers as he passed, giving himself a few extra seconds to think about what he was going to say. He hadn't figured it out by the time he reached the door. He knocked anyway. "Come in," said a voice. Linda May Calloway was smaller than he had imagined. Not frail, that wasn't the right word. Compact, like someone who had spent a lifetime making herself fit into whatever space the world offered without making a fuss about it. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at Daniel the way people look at strangers they have already decided to be honest with. "You're the officer?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Daniel Harper." She studied him. "You're the one who stayed on that rooftop with my girls." "I am." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "Sit down, then." He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. Linda watched him the whole time, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read people quickly, because she'd never had the luxury of being wrong about them. "How are they?" she asked. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Sophie is drawing," Daniel said. "Houses, mostly. With 2 windows." He paused. "Emily is watching the door." Something moved across Linda's face. Recognition, and underneath it, a pain she kept very well managed. "That's Emily," she said quietly. "She's been watching doors since she was 7 years old." Daniel nodded. He reached into his jacket and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photocopy Angela had made of Emily's letter, with Emily's permission. He held it out to Linda. She took it with both hands, unfolded it slowly. He watched her read, watched her lips press together when she reached the part about the hospital lights, watched her close her eyes for just a moment before continuing. When she finished, she folded it again along the same creases, precisely, gently, and held it against her chest the same way Sophie held her own note. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "She went up there because of what I told her," Linda said finally. "Not with guilt, with wonder. I used to take the girls to that rooftop when they were small. Back when I worked in that building, we'd go up after my shift and look out at the city." She paused. "I told them that from up high the world looks like it still has good things in it." "She believed you," Daniel said. "She always believed me too much," Linda said softly, "and not enough in herself." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, she believed in herself enough to make that call, to keep Sophie calm, to write that letter. Linda looked at him. Her eyes were sharp and clear despite everything. "Why are you here, Officer Harper?" she asked. Not unkindly, directly. "I've applied for temporary guardianship," he said, "of Emily and Sophie." Linda was very still. "You're a single man," she said. "Police officer, you don't know these children." "That's true. There's a couple, the Whitmores, who have a big house and experience." "I know about the Whitmores." "Then why you?" Daniel thought about it carefully. He wanted to give her a real answer, not a rehearsed one. "Because I read that letter," he said, "and I understood it, not as a case file, as a person who has also been standing somewhere high, looking at lights across a city, wondering if the people he loves are still okay." He paused. "I've made mistakes, Mrs. Calloway, with my own daughter. I can't fix those overnight. But I think, if you'll let me try, I can show up for yours." Linda held his gaze for a long time. The monitor beside her beeped steadily. The afternoon light came through the window in a long, quiet strip. Then she said, "Emily trusts you?" "I think she's starting to." "Sophie?" He almost smiled. "Sophie drew me into a picture." Linda looked down at her folded hands. Something shifted in her expression. not surrender. Something more like a decision made carefully, with full understanding of the weight. "You'd better not disappear," she said quietly. "No, ma'am," Daniel said. "I don't plan to." The form Angela had given Daniel turned out to be the first of many. Over the following 2 weeks, he filled out more paperwork than he had in 17 years on the force. Financial disclosures, background checks, personal references, a detailed account of his living situation, his work schedule, his income, his debts, all of it laid out on paper in black and white, with nowhere to hide the parts that weren't impressive. And there were parts that weren't impressive. He was carrying debt from the divorce, not catastrophic but visible. His apartment was 600 square feet on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. He paid monthly support to Karen for Grace, which he had never resented and never would. His savings account had enough in it to cover roughly 2 months of unexpected expenses, and not much more. He wrote it all down honestly. Because the one thing he had decided, sitting at that kitchen table after the rooftop, was that he was done being strategic with the truth. The home inspection was scheduled for a Thursday morning. A woman named Mrs. Parrish arrived exactly on time. Clipboard in hand, sensible shoes, the kind of practiced neutral expression that gave nothing away. She introduced herself politely and stepped inside. Daniel had cleaned the apartment 3 times in the 2 days before. He had borrowed a folding table from his neighbor, Roy, a 71-year-old retired school teacher who had lived across the hall for 9 years and asked very few questions. Roy had also helped him assemble the bunk bed he'd bought second-hand from a family 2 streets over. It was solid wood, painted white with a small ladder on the side. It fit in the corner of the bedroom with about 4 feet to spare. Mrs. Parrish wrote things down without commenting. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the fire escape access. She opened the window in the main room and noted the street noise. She asked about the heating system and Daniel answered everything directly. Then she sat down at the folding table and looked at him. "Mr. Harper," she said carefully, "there is another family being considered for this placement. I'm sure you're aware." "The Whitmores," he said. "Yes. They have a 4-bedroom home, a dedicated playroom, a yard. Mrs. Whitmore doesn't work outside the home." She paused. "They have prior experience with foster placement." Daniel nodded. He didn't flinch. "I know." "On paper," she said, "their application is stronger than yours." "I understand that." Mrs. Parrish looked at him for a moment, studying him the way Angela had, the way Linda had. Like everyone in this process had learned to look past the surface of things and find what was actually there. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Yes." "Why these girls?" Daniel thought about giving the careful answer, the responsible answer, the one that covered all the practical bases. Instead he said, "Because Emily wrapped a blanket around her sister before herself, on a cold rooftop in the middle of the night, when she had every reason to think about nobody but herself. She wrapped it around Sophie first." He paused. "I don't want someone like that to grow up believing the world didn't notice." Mrs. Parrish was quiet for a moment. She made a small note on her clipboard. Then she said, "There's one more thing I need to mention." The Whitmores were asked about their long-term intentions regarding keeping the sisters together. She said it carefully, watching his face. Their response was that they would prioritize what was developmentally appropriate, and that separation might be considered if it was deemed beneficial. Daniel went very still. "They said that officially?" he asked. "In their intake interview." "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. "Mrs. Parrish," Daniel said, "my apartment is small. My finances are tight. I work shifts that aren't always predictable." He leaned forward slightly. "But I will never, not once, not ever, suggest that those 2 girls are better off apart. That will never be on the table, not while I have anything to say about it." Mrs. Parrish looked at him. Then she made another note. She stood, thanked him for his time, and walked to the door. Just before she left, she turned back. "The bunk bed is a nice touch," she said. And then she was gone. Daniel stood in the middle of his small, clean apartment and breathed. Down the hall, Roy knocked twice on the wall, their old signal for how to go. Daniel knocked back once. "Don't know yet." He sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at the bunk bed across the room. 4 feet of space, white paint, a small ladder. It was everything he had to offer. He hoped it was enough. The visit was on a Saturday. Daniel arrived at Hillside with 2 brown bags, one with apples and crackers like before, and one with something new, a small watercolor set he had found at a craft store, with 12 colors and a little brush tucked into the lid. He had stood in the aisle for a while, not sure if it was too much or too little. He bought it anyway. Sophie saw the watercolors before he had fully sat down, and immediately claimed them as her own personal property. She opened every color, examined each one with great seriousness, and began painting what appeared to be a very ambitious orange sky. Emily watched this happen without smiling. Then she looked at Daniel. "I heard about the Whitmores," she said. He wasn't surprised that she knew. Children in institutional settings absorb information the way walls absorb sound. Quietly, completely, and from every direction. "What did you hear?" he asked. "That they have a big house." She paused. "And that they think sisters sometimes do better apart." Daniel kept his voice steady. "You heard that." One of the staff was talking in the hallway. Her eyes didn't waver. "She didn't know I was around the corner." He nodded slowly. He didn't try to soften it or spin it. "That's true," he said. "That's what they said." Emily's jaw tightened, just barely. Then she looked down at the table. Daniel waited. "Why do you even want us?" she asked. Her voice stayed flat, controlled. But underneath it, he could hear it. The real question. The one that had been building since the rooftop. Why would anyone choose this? Choose us? Choose hard? He didn't answer immediately. He thought about the careful answer, the reassuring answer, the answer that would sound right. He gave her the true one instead. "I have a daughter," he said. "Her name is Grace. She's 16. He paused. "I wasn't there for her the way I should have been. For a long time I told myself I was providing, working hard, keeping things stable. But I wasn't present. And she went through something difficult alone because I wasn't paying attention." Emily looked up at him. "I found out too late," he said, "and I've been carrying that ever since." He met her eyes. "When I saw you on that rooftop, the way you held Sophie, the way you wrapped that blanket around her before yourself, I recognized something. Not the situation, the feeling underneath it." He paused. "The feeling of loving someone so much that you'd stand anywhere, do anything, just to keep them from being afraid." Emily was very still. "I don't know if I'll be good at this," Daniel said. "I'm not going to pretend I have everything figured out. My apartment is small. My life is complicated. But I know one thing." He leaned forward slightly. "I will never suggest that you and Sophie are better off apart. Not once. Not ever. That is the one thing I can promise you right now. And I mean it completely." The room was quiet except for Sophie humming softly to herself, and the gentle sound of her brush moving across paper. Emily looked at him for a long time. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She did something more complicated than both. She just kept looking at him steadily, the way someone looks when they are deciding whether to believe something they want very badly to be true. Then she looked away. "Sophie likes you," she said. It was the same thing she had said before, but this time it landed differently. This time it was not a deflection. It was a door, cracked open just slightly. Daniel nodded. "I like her too." A pause. "She doesn't like everyone," Emily said, as if this were important data. "I know," he said. "I consider it a significant honor." And then, briefly, quickly, almost hidden, Emily smiled. It was small. It lasted less than a second. She looked down at the table immediately after as if she hadn't meant to let it out. But Daniel saw it. Sophie chose that exact moment to hold up her painting, a burst of orange and yellow, and an unexpected amount of purple, with 3 small figures standing beneath it. "It's the sunrise," she announced. "And that's us." Daniel looked at the painting. 3 figures, 2 small ones and 1 tall one, standing together. He looked at Emily. She was looking at the painting too, and this time the smile stayed a little longer. The letter from the psychological evaluator arrived on a Wednesday. Daniel read it standing in the hallway outside his apartment, still in his jacket, keys in hand. He had known the evaluation was coming. He had sat across from Dr. Renata Ellis for 2 sessions, answered her questions honestly, the same way he had answered everything in this process, without strategy, without performance. He had thought that was enough. The report didn't say he was unfit. It was more careful than that. It used words like emotionally guarded and history of relational withdrawal and ongoing unresolved estrangement from biological daughter. It concluded that his application was viable but borderline, pending demonstrated improvement in personal relationships and emotional availability. Borderline. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and called Grace. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was careful, not cold, but careful, the voice of someone who had learned to protect herself from disappointment. Dad. Hey, Bug. The old nickname came out before he could stop it. He heard her go quiet on the other end. I know this is unexpected. I needed to hear your voice. A pause. Are you okay? I'm trying to be, he said. I'm trying to do something I should have started a long time ago. He exhaled. I'm sorry, Grace. Not the easy kind of sorry. The kind that means I understand what I did and I'm not going to pretend I don't. She didn't respond immediately. He didn't rush her. Okay, she said finally. Quiet. Careful. But she didn't hang up. They talked for 11 minutes. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a resolution. But it was real. Two people on either end of a long silence, deciding to speak anyway. When he hung up, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he wrote a letter to the court, not through Angela, not through a lawyer, in his own words, by hand, explaining who he was and who he was working to become. He included the psychological report without minimizing it. He wrote about Grace. He wrote about the rooftop. He wrote about a folded piece of paper that a 5-year-old carried everywhere because it was the closest thing she had to safety. He sealed it and drove it to the courthouse himself. Angela called him the next morning. The hearing is set for Friday, she said. And Daniel, a pause. Linda sent a letter to the judge, handwritten. What does it say? I don't know, Angela said. She sealed it herself. The judge has it. Another pause. He's already read it twice. The call came at 8:47 p.m. Daniel was sitting on the floor of his apartment back against the couch, looking at the bunk bed through the open bedroom door. He had been sitting there for a while, not thinking exactly, just being in the quiet of what tomorrow meant. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. It was a clerk from the family court office. Her voice was professional and apologetic in equal measure. There had been a documentation error. A form in his application had been filed under the wrong case number. It was a clerical mistake, not his fault, but it needed to be corrected before the hearing could proceed. If it wasn't resolved by 9 a.m. Friday, the hearing would be postponed. 30 days. During those 30 days, pending placement would be reassigned. The girls would be moved to interim foster homes. Separately, Daniel stood up slowly. He walked to the kitchen. He set his phone on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. He wanted to be angry. He had enough in him for that. But underneath the anger was something quieter and more frightening. The feeling of a door swinging shut on something that had taken everything he had to pry open. He picked up the phone and called Angela. She answered immediately, which told him she had already heard. I know, she said before he could speak. I'm already working on it. The courthouse document system closes at 9 tonight. I have 40 minutes. Angela. Go home, Daniel. Let me work. He paced his apartment for the next 40 minutes. 6 steps to the window. 6 steps back. The city outside was dark and ordinary. People walking dogs. A late delivery truck moving slowly down the street. Lights in windows where families were finishing dinners and watching television and living lives that had nothing to do with courtrooms or case numbers. At 9:11 p.m., Angela called back. It's done, she said. She sounded tired in the way that people sound when they've been running on will alone. The correction is filed. The hearing stands. Daniel exhaled, long and slow. Thank you. Get some sleep, she said. You need to be clear-headed tomorrow. He didn't sleep. Not really. He lay on top of his covers and stared at the ceiling and thought about Emily watching the door, about Sophie sleeping with his badge under her pillow. He had heard that from a staff member who mentioned it like a small, ordinary thing, not understanding that it wasn't ordinary at all. At midnight, he picked up his phone and opened Grace's contact. He typed, I have a hearing tomorrow. For 2 little girls who needed someone to show up. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be that person now. I love you. Always. He sent it before he could reconsider. 3 minutes later, a reply came back. I know, Dad. Good luck tomorrow. 4 words. And a period at the end that felt like a beginning. He set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then, quietly, he said to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone, "Don't let me get this wrong." The courthouse on Friday morning smelled like old wood and recycled air. Daniel arrived 40 minutes early. He wore the only suit he owned, dark navy, slightly too formal for most occasions in his life, which meant it had been used exactly twice before. He had pressed it the night before with an iron he borrowed from Roy, who had handed it over without comment and then said quietly, "You're doing a good thing, son." Daniel had nodded and not trusted himself to speak. He sat in the hallway outside courtroom C and watched people move past. Lawyers with rolling briefcases, clerks carrying folders, a young couple holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone pale. The ordinary traffic of a place where ordinary lives got decided. Angela arrived 12 minutes later. She sat beside him without preamble and opened her folder. "The Whitmores are already inside," she said quietly. "Their attorney is with them." Daniel nodded. "They have an attorney." "They do." He had no attorney. He had his letter, his honest paperwork, and 11 minutes of phone call with his daughter. Angela seemed to read his thoughts. "The judge in this case is Harold Beaumont, 23 years on the family court bench." She paused. "He is not impressed by attorneys." Daniel almost smiled. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Wood paneling, 2 long tables facing a raised bench, a flag in the corner, fluorescent lights doing their best. The Whitmores were seated at the left table. Mark Whitmore was tall and composed, in a dark suit. Eleanor Whitmore sat with her hands folded, her expression arranged into something that looked like warmth, but had the quality of something practiced. Their attorney shuffled papers. Daniel sat at the right table, alone. Judge Beaumont entered without theater. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He sat, opened a folder, and read for a moment in silence. Then he looked up. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to acknowledge that I've received written correspondence from Mrs. Linda Calloway." He held up a sealed envelope, now open. "I've read it carefully. It will be entered into the record." He looked at both tables. "I'm going to be direct," he said. "I am not here to reward resources. I am not here to punish circumstances. I am here to determine what arrangement serves the continuity, stability, and emotional well-being of 2 children who have already experienced more disruption than any child should." He looked at the Whitmore table, then at Daniel. "Mr. Harper," he said, "I've read your letter as well, the one you delivered by hand." Daniel straightened slightly. "You wrote something that I've been thinking about since yesterday afternoon." The judge removed his glasses. "You wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that the system sometimes processes children the way it processes paperwork, efficiently, but without memory of what the paper represents." The courtroom was quiet. "That is either a very perceptive observation," the judge said, "or a very convenient one." He looked at Daniel steadily. "I'd like to find out which." He leaned forward. "Mr. Harper, if you could promise these girls only one thing, what would it be?" The courtroom was so quiet that Daniel could hear the clock on the wall. He had prepared for many questions: financial stability, living arrangements, work schedule. He had answers ready, honest ones, imperfect ones, but real. He had not prepared for this. "If you could promise these girls only one thing, what would it be?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about the rooftop, the wind, 2 small figures standing where no one should ever have to stand. He thought about Emily's letter. "We're not easier apart, we're just lonelier." He thought about Sophie pressing a folded note against her chest. He thought about Linda in a hospital bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, refusing to stop fighting. He thought about Grace, about 11 minutes on the phone, about 4 words, and a period that felt like a beginning. He looked at Judge Beaumont. "That they'll never have to stand on a rooftop again to be seen," he said. The words came out quietly, without performance, the way true things come out when you've stopped trying to manage how they land. The judge looked at him for a long moment. The Whitmore's attorney shifted in his seat. Eleanor Whitmore glanced at her husband. Mark Whitmore kept his eyes forward, expression unchanged. Judge Beaumont wrote something down, slowly. Then he set his pen aside. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "in your intake interview, you indicated that separation of the siblings might be considered if deemed developmentally beneficial." He looked at them steadily. "Do you stand by that position?" Eleanor Whitmore leaned toward their attorney. A brief, whispered exchange. Then the attorney spoke. The Whitmores would always prioritize professional guidance in such matters, Your Honor. The judge nodded once, wrote something else down. I'm going to take a 10-minute recess, he said. He stood. Everyone stood. And then he walked through the door behind the bench and it closed quietly behind him. 10 minutes. Daniel sat at the table and looked at his hands. The Whitmores spoke in low voices with their attorney across the room. Angela sat in the gallery, still and watchful. At minute 4, the door to the courtroom opened. Not the judge's door, the main door. A court staff member entered, and behind her, moving quickly and slightly out of breath, were 2 small figures. Emily, Sophie. A shelter supervisor followed, slightly flustered, explaining that the girls had been brought for observation per standard procedure and had gotten ahead of her in the hallway. Sophie saw Daniel immediately. She crossed the courtroom in 7 running steps, past the tables, past the formality, past everything the room was supposed to be, and wrapped both arms around him as tightly as a 5-year-old can hold on to something she is absolutely certain about. Daniel held her. His throat tightened. He looked up. Emily was standing a few feet away, hands at her sides. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the rooftop, steady, measuring, older than she had any right to be. Then she walked over and sat in the empty chair beside him. She didn't hug him. She just sat there, close enough that their arms touched. That was everything. The judge returned at exactly 10 minutes. He looked at the scene in front of him. Daniel at the table, Sophie still holding on, Emily beside him with her quiet, watchful eyes, and he was still for just a moment. Then he sat down. He opened the folder in front of him, and he began to read. Judge Beaumont read for what felt like a very long time. The courtroom was completely still. Sophie had settled into the chair beside Daniel, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, holding on with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made up her mind about things. Emily sat on his other side, straight-backed and watchful, her eyes on the judge's face. Daniel didn't look at the Whitmores. He didn't look at Angela. He looked at the flag in the corner of the room and breathed as steadily as he could. Then Judge Beaumont closed the folder. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench in front of him. He looked out at the room, at both tables, at the gallery, at the 2 girls sitting beside a man in a slightly too formal navy suit who had delivered his paperwork by hand and had no attorney, and had answered the most important question of the morning without a single rehearsed word. "I've been doing this for 23 years, the judge said. His voice was measured, unhurried. The voice of someone who understood that the words he was about to say would live in people's memories for a long time. In that time, I have learned that the law is a framework. It tells us what is permissible. It does not always tell us what is right." He looked down at the folder again briefly, then back up. "I have read Mrs. Linda Calloway's letter. I will not share its contents in full. They were written in confidence and they will remain so. But I will say this." He paused. "In 23 years, I have received a great deal of correspondence, from attorneys, from social workers, from evaluators with advanced degrees and impressive credentials." Another pause. "I have rarely been as certain of the truth of something as I was reading 4 handwritten pages from a 67-year-old woman writing from a hospital bed." The room was quiet. "Mrs. Calloway did not ask me to choose Mr. Harper," the judge continued. "She asked me to choose her girls. She asked me to remember that Emily and Sophie are not a case number. They are not a placement statistic. They are 2 human beings who have already lost more than children should lose, and who have, despite that, shown a capacity for love and loyalty that most adults spend their entire lives trying to find." He looked at the Whitmore table. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, your application is thorough. Your intentions appear genuine. The court thanks you for your willingness to open your home." He said it without coldness. "However, the court is not able to consider any placement arrangement in which the separation of these siblings remains an open possibility. These girls will not be separated. That is not a preference. It is a condition." Eleanor Whitmore looked at her hands. Mark Whitmore nodded once, slowly. Judge Beaumont turned to Daniel. "Mr. Harper, your application is imperfect. Your finances are limited. Your living space is modest. Your psychological evaluation flagged areas of concern that are real and will require ongoing attention." He looked at him steadily. "You are also a man who sat down on a cold rooftop and chose presence over protocol, who delivered his own letter by hand because he wanted the court to know he meant it, who, when asked what he would promise two children, did not promise them comfort or stability or opportunity. A pause. He promised them that they would be seen. Sophie tightened her grip on Daniel's fingers. Temporary guardianship of Emily Rose Morrison and Sophie Ann Morrison is granted to Daniel James Harper, effective immediately, pending continued compliance with all supervisory requirements, regular check-ins with family services, and ongoing psychological support for all parties. He brought down the gavel once. The sound was small, clean, final. Daniel sat very still for a moment. Then Sophie climbed into his lap, wrapped her arms around his neck, and said into his ear, with complete and total confidence, "I knew." He laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. He held her and looked over her shoulder at Emily. Emily was looking at him. Her eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together, trying, in her careful way, to hold something in. She didn't quite manage it. One tear, just one. She wiped it away immediately with the back of her hand, as if it didn't count if you were fast enough. Daniel reached over and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. The weeks that followed were not easy. The apartment was crowded in ways Daniel hadn't fully anticipated. Shoes in the hallway, crayon marks on the wall beside the bunk bed that he decided immediately not to address. The particular chaos of a small space suddenly containing 3 people with 3 different rhythms. Sophie adapted the way 5-year-olds adapt, completely and without apology. She claimed the bottom bunk, organized her watercolors on the windowsill with great seriousness, and informed Roy across the hall that he was now her neighbor and was expected to wave. Roy waved every single time. Emily took longer. She was watchful at first, careful with her trust, careful with her space, careful with everything. There were quiet evenings when Daniel would find her sitting at the kitchen table long after Sophie was asleep, just thinking. He never pushed. He would pour 2 glasses of water and sit across from her and let the quiet be companionable rather than heavy. Slowly, gradually, in the way that real things happen, she began to unfold, not all the way, not overnight, but enough. Linda was moved to a Medicaid-assisted living facility 6 weeks after the hearing. It was a small place, clean and warm, with a garden in the back that she could see from her window. The girls visited every Sunday without exception. Emily would read to her. Sophie would show her that week's paintings, narrating each one with the gravity of a professional artist presenting her portfolio. Linda sat in her chair by the window and received all of it like sunlight. One Sunday, as Daniel waited in the hallway while the girls were inside with Linda, Angela appeared beside him. She had stopped by to check in. Officially, that was the reason. But she stood with him in the hallway for a while, listening to the sound of Sophie's voice rising and falling with great enthusiasm over something she was explaining, and the lower murmur of Emily reading, and underneath it all, the sound of Linda laughing. "How are you doing?" Angela asked. "Better," Daniel said, and meant it. He called Grace every week now. The conversations were still finding their shape, sometimes easy, sometimes careful, always honest. She had agreed to meet for lunch the following month. It was written in his calendar in pen, not pencil. He wasn't going to miss it. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, Daniel came home from a shift to find Sophie asleep on the couch with a crayon still in her hand and a drawing on the coffee table in front of her. He picked it up carefully. It was the house again, the one with 2 windows, but this time it had a garden, and 4 figures standing in front of it instead of 3. He looked at it for a long time. Emily came out of the bedroom and saw him looking at it. "She added Linda," Emily said. Daniel nodded. His throat was tight. Emily leaned against the doorframe for a moment. Then she walked over and stood beside him, looking at the drawing too. "She wanted everyone in the picture," Emily said quietly. They stood there together, the careful girl and the imperfect man, in a small apartment with crayon marks on the wall and a bunk bed in the corner and a garden drawing on the table, and neither of them said anything for a little while. Then Emily reached into her pocket and held something out. Daniel looked down. It was his badge, the one Sophie had kept under her pillow for weeks. He had assumed it was still there. "She said you don't need it anymore," Emily said. "She said we know who you are without it." Daniel took it slowly, held it in his palm. He looked at Emily. "She's right," he said. Emily almost smiled. She usually is. He wasn't supposed to find them there, but he did. And it turned out that being in the right place at the right time wasn't about luck. It was about finally, after a long time of almost, deciding to show up, not for a case, not for a protocol. For two girls who had climbed to the highest place they could find, not because they were giving up, but because they needed someone to finally look up and see them. The end. Presenting files. Presenting files. Presented files, concluido. Thank you for going on this journey. The story of Daniel, Emily, Sophie, and Linda is now complete. All 15 chapters written with heart, suspense, and a redemption that was earned slowly and honestly, the way real things are.